My son stole my war medals and sold them for $5,000 to pay his gambling debts. My heart shattered, but I said nothing. Instead, I walked straight to a realtor and sold the house they were living in, the house that had always been mine. The day the new owner arrived, my daughter-in-law was mid-live stream when I walked through the door. "This is my house," she screamed on her knees in the driveway. I didn't say another word, because what came next they never saw coming. Thank you for being here on Wise Revenge. It means everything. Now tell me in the comments, what city or country are you joining from today? Let's see how far this story travels. Heads up. Some elements of this story are fictional, added to serve the telling and the lesson. Any similarity to actual people or locations is purely coincidental, but what this story teaches you is absolutely worth your time. My hands were still greasy from a late transmission job when I pulled into the driveway that evening. January in Yonkers has a particular kind of cold, the kind that settles into your bones before you even step out of the truck. I sat there for a moment with the engine idling, watching my breath fog up the windshield, and thought about nothing in particular. That was still possible back then. Thinking about nothing. I did not know it would be one of the last evenings I could afford to. I had been repairing engines out of my garage on South Yonkers for 11 years. Before that, I spent 2 decades working for a freight company up in Westchester County. Quiet work. Honest work. The kind of work that leaves your hands rough and your conscience clean. I was 62 years old, and I had built a life out of understanding how broken things could be put back together if you had the patience and the right tools. The house was a 2-story colonial on Birchwood Drive. I bought it in 2001 with money from a land settlement, after the old family property in upstate New York was sold. My wife Donna had picked out the front door herself. She stood in the paint aisle at the hardware store for 40 minutes before choosing a shade of blue she called honest. I never argued with her about colors. I never argued with Donna about much of anything. She was gone now 4 years in March, and the house had been quieter than I ever wanted it to be. Derek and his wife Sienna had moved in 18 months ago. My son was 32, a licensed real estate broker, who carried himself like a man who had already made his first million and was working on his second. He had not. I knew the numbers. I had seen the credit card statements he left carelessly on the kitchen counter, the past due notices he shoved underneath the junk mail pile. Derek owed money to people who did not send polite reminders. I had told myself it was temporary. Parents tell themselves a lot of things. I went inside and hung my jacket on the hook by the back door. The house smelled like it always did, old wood and something faintly floral from the candles. Sienna burned constantly, the kind that cost more than my weekly grocery run. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink and dried them on the dish towel Donna had embroidered with small yellow daisies. I still used that towel every day. Some habits are the last things you surrender. I was heading toward the bedroom to change my shirt when I noticed the door was already slightly open. I always kept it closed. My chest tightened before my brain caught up with my body. I pushed the door open with 2 fingers and stood in the frame. The room looked undisturbed at first. Bed-made curtains drawn the framed photograph of Donna still sitting on the dresser where I kept it. But the bottom drawer of the nightstand was pulled all the way out and sitting crooked, like it had been yanked open in a hurry and shoved back without care. I crossed the room in 4 steps. The metal lockbox was still there, but the combination had been forced. The lid sat open at a wrong angle, the small latch bent backward. I reached down and picked it up with both hands. Empty, my silver star, my bronze star, my purple heart, my Army Commendation Medal. Every piece of metal I had carried home from the Gulf in 1991, things I had never once displayed, never once talked about, never once used to ask anything of anyone. Gone. My legs felt strange. I sat down on the edge of the bed and held the empty box in my lap. The bent latch caught the light from the hallway in a way that made it look almost decorative. I stared at it for a long time. I reached into my wallet and found the small photograph I had carried there for 4 years. Donna at the kitchen table laughing at something off-camera coffee cup halfway to her mouth. I set it on the nightstand next to the empty box and looked at both of them. She always said Derek needed a harder hand than I ever gave him. I said to no one. I could have called the police. The theft of military decorations in New York State qualifies as grand larceny in the 4th degree under penal law, section 155.30, a felony charge when the value of the property exceeds $1,000. A silver star alone clears that threshold. I knew the law. I had looked it up once years ago in a different context. I remembered it now with a clarity that surprised me. But I did not reach for my phone. The medals were already gone. Whoever had taken them had almost certainly sold them. Filing a report would mean investigators questions Derek's name in paperwork. And what I felt sitting on that bed was not the kind of anger that wants sirens and flashing lights. It was the other kind. The kind that goes very quiet and starts to think. I called Derek's cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again. Same result. On the 3rd call, I left no message. I just hung up and set the phone face down on the nightstand beside Donna's photograph. Then I sat in the dark and waited. I did not turn on the lamp. I did not turn on the television. I just sat there with the empty box in my lap and listened to the house settle around me the way old houses do in winter, creaks and groans from the walls, the furnace cycling on and off in the basement. Donna used to say the house breathed. I had always thought that was the kind of thing only she could get away with saying. 20 minutes passed. Maybe 30. Then I heard the sound I had been expecting, tires on the gravel headlights sweeping briefly across the curtains, a car door closing without care. Footsteps on the porch, the front door opening. I heard Derek call out from the entry hall. "Dad, you home?" His voice sounded normal. That told me everything. I did not answer. I did not move. I just sat on the edge of the bed in the dark room and watched the strip of light appear under the bedroom door as he turned on the hallway light. Then the footsteps stopped just outside. The bedroom door swung open slowly. I talked for a long time. I had not talked like that in years. Not about Kuwait, not about the Corps of Engineers, not about any of it. The words came out slowly at first, the way water comes out of a pipe that has been shut off for too long with resistance, and then all at once. Eddie sat on his stool across the counter and did not interrupt. He refilled my coffee once without asking. Outside Tremont Avenue went through its early evening rhythms, a bus hissing to a stop car, horns, someone's music thumping past and fading, and inside the shop the only sounds were my voice, and the low murmur of the television I had forgotten was on. I told him about the Gulf War in the way I had always needed to tell it, which was from the outside in. The facts first. The unit. The assignment. The Corps of Engineers, whose job in a combat zone is not to fight in the conventional sense, but to build and clear and make passable the ground that other men need to cross. Roads, bridges, minefields. Especially minefields. In February of 1991, during the ground campaign in Kuwait, my unit was tasked with clearing a route through an area of desert that intelligence had flagged as potentially mined. It was night. There was no moon. I was 29 years old, and I had been in country for 4 months, and I understood in the particular way that soldiers understand things, that the work in front of me was the kind that did not always end with the person who started it. I told Eddie about the ground, how desert sand in that part of Kuwait had a particular density in winter, how the way it compacted told you things about what might be underneath it, how you learned to read it, the way you learned to read anything with patience and repetition, and the knowledge that being wrong had consequences that could not be undone. I told him about the 7 hours. I did not tell him everything. There are parts of that night I have never told anyone and do not intend to. But I told him enough. I told him about the men who made it through and the ones who did not. I told him about the recommendation that came after the one that went into a classified file and stayed there because the mission itself was classified, because the route we cleared and the intelligence it protected could not be acknowledged without exposing things that were not mine to expose. I told him about coming home, about the limp that showed up in cold weather, about the box I had locked the medals into and put in a drawer and not opened for 33 years. When I finished, Eddie sat for a moment with his coffee mug in both hands looking at the counter. "My son sold those medals to your shop for $5,000, I said, "to pay a gambling debt." Eddie's jaw tightened. He set the mug down. "How old is he?" 32. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man processing something that confirmed a suspicion he had already formed. "All right," he said. "Tell me about the garage." I had mentioned the shop, my repair shop on South Yonkers, when I was giving him the background on Derek. Eddie had caught the detail the way he caught most details, quietly and without making a show of it. "Derek still has a key," I said. "A copy he made about a year ago when I gave him the original to grab some tools for a job I was letting him use. I never asked for it back." "Does he know you know he has it?" "No." Eddie looked at me steadily. "Then don't change the lock." I understood what he meant immediately. It was the same logic I had applied to dozens of mechanical problems over the years. If a system has a vulnerability, and you want to understand the full extent of the damage, you do not seal the vulnerability. You watch it. "He'll go back," Eddie said. "Men like that always go back. They took something once and it worked, so they'll try again. He knows what's in that garage, tools, parts, equipment. He'll calculate the value and he'll decide the risk is worth it, especially now that he has no house and no income coming." He paused. "When he does, you want a record of it." "I was thinking the same thing," I said. "You know anything about security cameras?" "I know enough." Eddie reached under the counter and produced a small cardboard box. Inside were 3 wireless cameras, each about the size of a pack of cards. He set them on the glass between us. These link to an app on your phone. Motion activated, timestamp on every frame. The footage is stored in the cloud, which means even if someone finds the cameras and destroys them, the recording survives. I looked at the cameras. How much? Consider it a loan, he said. From one veteran to another. I drove to the garage on South Yonkers that same night and installed all three. I had done enough electrical work over the years to know how to hide a wire and how to position a lens to maximize field of view while minimizing visibility. Camera 1 went behind the metal shelving unit along the north wall, angled to cover the main floor. Camera 2 went above the workbench in the corner, covering the vehicle bay. Camera 3 I tucked into the rafters above the door, positioned to capture anyone entering or exiting. I checked all three feeds from the app on my phone, standing in the dark center of the garage. Every angle was clean. Every corner of the space was covered. I had deliberately left the most valuable items in plain sight: a new set of 4 all-terrain tires I had ordered in November, and not yet mounted the transmission assembly I had pulled from a client's truck and was rebuilding, and the drive shaft components laid out on the workbench. Combined value somewhere north of $4,000. Enough to constitute grand larceny in the third degree under New York Penal Law, Section 155.35, which applied to theft of property valued over $3,000, a Class D felony, carrying a potential sentence of up to 7 years. I was not leaving bait by accident. I stood in the middle of the garage with my phone in my hand and 3 camera feeds glowing on the screen, and said the only thing that seemed appropriate. "Come on, Derek," I said to the empty room, to the dark and the cold, and the smell of oil and metal that had been the most honest smell of my life for 30 years. "I know how you think. I taught you how to think. And I know you're going to come through that door." I drove home. I slept for the first time in 4 days. 3 days later, at 2:17 in the morning, the motion sensor on camera 2 activated, and my phone lit up on the nightstand. I picked it up and looked at the screen. Derek's face was clearly visible in the workbench camera's night vision feed, pale and flat in the green-white glow as he reached for the transmission assembly with both hands. I did not call the police. I did not call Eddie. I set the phone on the pillow beside me where I could watch the screen, and I waited, and I watched my son work. Before I show you what Walter found on that camera at 2 in the morning and what he did with it before sunrise. Comment the number 7 right now so I know you're still with me. Because what happens next is the moment everything changes. And a note before we continue: parts of this story include fictional elements crafted for dramatic and educational purposes. If that's not your thing, no hard feelings at all. You can step away right here. 3 weeks passed. I spent them working and sleeping better than I had in months. Eddie and I met with Carol Marsh on a Thursday afternoon in late March. Her office on Lexington Avenue, 14th floor, a woman who did not waste time on pleasantries. I put the Sony recorder on her desk and played the relevant portions. I told her about Eddie's presence in the hospital hallway and what he had heard. She listened without interrupting, made notes, and when I finished, she looked up. Under New York Penal Law, Section 155.05, subsection 2e, larceny by extortion includes obtaining property by instilling fear of future financial harm. The demand for $50,000 framed as compensation for your lawful exercise of property rights meets the threshold. She set down her pen. Combined with a corroborating eyewitness account of the complainant's actual condition at the time of the alleged injury, this is workable. I'll need a formal written statement from your witness, Eddie said. Tell me where to sign. Carol's office had a notary. We used her that afternoon. Derek's birthday was the second Saturday of April. I went to the county clerk's office on a Wednesday and requested a certified copy of his birth certificate in New York State. A parent named on the document can request a copy for a child of any age. The clerk processed it in 11 minutes. I found a plain white gift box at a hardware store, lined it with tissue paper, placed the birth certificate in the center. Then I sat at the kitchen table and wrote the letter by hand. It took 4 drafts. The 4th was right. I did not call it a legal document because it was not one. No letter written at a kitchen table can dissolve the biological fact of parenthood or create enforceable obligations. What I was writing was a personal statement of accounting made for my own clarity as much as for his. 1 paragraph. I read it once, folded it, placed it under the birth certificate, sealed the box, and took it to the post office on Friday morning. The package was delivered on Saturday at 8:40. Derek told me later he had been awake since 6. The birthday arriving the way bad anniversaries arrive, with gray inevitability traffic noise from Central Avenue and the particular weight of everything the year had contained. He had been hoping in the part of himself that had not stopped hoping that the box might contain a check. Something that said the accounting between them was not as final as it felt. The weight told him it was not that. He opened it alone. Sienna was still asleep. The birth certificate was on top, official state folder, raised seal of New York. His full name, his date of birth, his mother's name, Donna Marie Briggs, his father's Walter Raymond Briggs. Underneath was the letter. 1 paragraph, 4 sentences. The debt of raising you for 32 years I consider paid in full. I want to be clear that this is not a legal document and carries no legal weight in either direction. It is a personal statement made for my own clarity. What I owe you and what you owe me have both been settled to my satisfaction. From this day forward, we are strangers who share a history. W.R.B. Derek read it 3 times. Then he set it on the desk and sat in the chair by the window and pressed both hands flat against his thighs and stared at the parking lot below. He told me later that what surprised him was not the anger came fast and hot, and he understood it. What surprised him was what came before the anger. A few seconds of something quieter and harder to name, not being wounded. Being seen clearly for the first time by someone who had decided the view was not worth continuing to look at. He sat with that for as long as he could stand it. Then he stood up the chair, scraping back hard, and Sienna woke and said his name from the bed. She saw the box. She saw what was on the desk. Derek. Her voice sharpened. Don't go over there. Not like this. The door was already open. I'll be back, he said. He was not back for 3 hours. I heard him before I saw him. The garage door was open to the April air, and I was on my back under a Ford F-250, replacing a brake line when the footsteps came across the concrete apron outside. Heavy and fast. The footsteps of a man who has been walking hard for a long time and has not yet decided what to do when he stops. I kept working. The footsteps came through the door and stopped. I heard him breathing, elevated the breath of someone carrying something too heavy to carry quietly much longer. "I've been expecting you," I said from under the truck. I finished the fitting another 40 seconds done right and slid out on the creeper. I stood up and looked at my son. Derek was in the middle of the garage floor with his hands at his sides and his jaw set and his eyes moving around the space the way eyes move when a man is trying to locate solid ground. Still wearing the jacket from this morning. His birthday. He looked older than 32. I picked up the rag from the workbench and waited. "You had no right," he said. His voice came out rougher than intended. "That letter, that document, you had no right to send it. On my birthday." "I had every right," I said. "It's my name on that birth certificate, too." "You're throwing me away." He took 2 steps toward me. "That's what it says. Writing off your own son like a bad debt." "That's not what it says." "That's exactly what it says." His voice cracked. He stopped and breathed through his nose. "You chose today on purpose." I did not deny it. He moved to the workbench and put both hands on the edge and leaned forward with his head down. His knuckles were white against the metal. "Mom would hate this," he said, low and deliberate, each word aimed. "She believed in family. She believed you kept trying no matter what. And you're standing here on my birthday telling me you're done with me." He looked up, the redness working in from the corners of his eyes. "You think she'd be okay with this? You think she'd feel good about what you've become?" The garage was quiet. Outside, 2 blocks over, someone was running a leaf blower. I set the rag down. I walked to the back office and came out with a book, brown leather cover, soft from handling the spine, creased from being opened to the same pages many times. I set it on the workbench between us and opened it to the page marked with a strip of masking tape. "Your mother's," I said. "She kept it the last 2 years of her life." Read it. Out loud. Derek looked at the book, then at me. Then he picked it up with both hands and found the passage. His voice started at normal volume and dropped within the first sentence, the particular drop that happens when a person encounters a private version of someone they thought they knew completely. "Derek has my soft heart." He read, "And I am afraid I have let him get away with too much because of it. He is 30 years old and still borrowing against tomorrow, and I don't know how to fix that from where I'm standing. Walter knows. Walter has always known. He just loves Derek too much to be the one to say it." His hands tightened on the book. His voice dropped further. "If I go before him, and I think I might, though I don't say it out loud, I need Walter to do what I couldn't. Be hard. Be honest. Don't look the other way because it hurts. Derek has enough of me in him to come through it if someone refuses to let him stay lost." A pause. Derek breathed, continued. "Use every tool you have, Walter. Every single one. If you have to be the bad man for a while, be the bad man. I will rest easier knowing you tried, and I will rest easier knowing Derek had someone who loved him enough to refuse to let him go gently to ruin." Derek stopped reading. He stood with the book open in his hands and did not move. The red at the corners of his eyes had spread all the way in. His jaw was working in the way jaws work when a man is holding back something that is pressing very hard to get out. Then it got out. Not gradually, all at once, the way structural things give way, the way a load-bearing element fails, and everything above it comes down together. His shoulders came forward, and his head dropped, and he made a sound that had no name, and then it became crying full and unguarded, the kind that men do not do in front of their fathers, unless something has broken all the way through. I did not go to him. I folded the rag in thirds and set it on the workbench. I looked at the silver star in its case on the shelf where I had placed it the week I brought it home from Eddie's shop. After a while, Derek straightened. He closed the journal with both hands carefully. The way you close something you have just understood has value. He set it on the workbench and did not look at me. I picked the journal up. Then I reached past it and set the silver star case on the workbench beside it, the two of them side by side under the garage lights. "Your mother gave me the strength to earn that," I said. "She gave me the same strength to do what I've done these past months." I looked at my son, the red eyes, the wet jaw, the hands gone very still. She wasn't asking me to be cruel, Derek. She was asking me to be honest. There's a difference. I hope someday you understand it. Derek looked at the journal and the medal and said nothing. "The door is behind you," I said. I picked up the rag, turned back to the truck, and lowered myself onto the creeper. I slid back under the chassis. Above me, I heard my son stand in the garage for a long moment. Then his footsteps crossed the concrete floor, slow this time, and I heard the garage door behind him as he walked out into the April morning. The text came on a Thursday morning in the second week of May. I was opening the garage at 6:50 when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. 4 sentences. Your daughter-in-law checked out last night. Left around 11 with 2 large suitcases. There was a man with a car I didn't recognize. Thought you should know. Signed with a first name Raymond, the night manager at the Extended Stay America on Central Avenue. I had given him my number 3 weeks ago when I dropped off tools for Derek, and Raymond had struck me as the kind of man who paid attention to things. I read the message twice, put my phone back in my pocket, started the coffee maker. I had known something like this was coming. Not the specific shape of it, not the suitcases, not the 11 o'clock departure, but the outline had been visible for months to anyone willing to look at it directly. I thought about the phone pressed against her thigh at my kitchen table in January. The bathroom door closed for 15 minutes in the hotel room, while Derek sat outside believing it was her cousin on the line. It was not her cousin. I had known that then. I had filed it away. "I know Donna," I said to the empty garage. "I saw it coming too." I called Eddie at 7:15. He arrived 40 minutes later with 2 coffees from the diner on McLean Avenue. I gave him the details while we stood at the workbench. "How's Derek?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "Haven't heard from him since the garage in April." Eddie nodded. "You think he knew she was planning to leave?" "No," I said. "She used him for as long as he had something she needed. When it was clear he didn't, she recalculated." We drove to Carol Marsh's office on Lexington Avenue that afternoon. I had told her in March the situation was developing. Sienna's departure was the cleanest possible confirmation of intent. A person acting in good faith does not pack 2 suitcases at 11 at night and leave without a forwarding address. Carol listened and made notes. When I finished, she looked up. "The recording from your kitchen," she said. 43 minutes, the demand explicitly stated. "Correct. And Mr. Kowalski is prepared to provide a formal written statement regarding what he heard in the hospital corridor." Eddie said, "Already drafted. I can sign it today." Carol's office had a notary. We used her. Under New York Penal Law, Section 155.05, subsection 2E, Carol said larceny by extortion is a Class D felony when the value demanded exceeds $3,000. The demand was $50,000. The recording establishes it clearly. The witness statement corroborates the complainant's actual condition at the time of the alleged injury. She closed the folder. I'll file the formal complaint with the district attorney's office in Westchester County this week. What happens to Sienna? I asked. The DA will attempt to locate her for questioning. If charges are filed and she fails to appear, a warrant will be issued. Carol paused. Leaving the state does not insulate her from New York criminal jurisdiction for acts committed within the state. People who run usually don't think past the running. I thought about Cancun. About 2 weeks already booked in her mind before she had even asked Derek to make the call. We shook hands at the door. Eddie and I took the elevator down and pushed out onto Lexington Avenue. The afternoon was mild and bright, the kind of May afternoon that makes the city look briefly like somewhere people chose to be. My phone rang at the corner of 46th Street. Derek. I stood with the May sun on my face and looked at his name through 3 full rings. Eddie stood beside me and said nothing. On the 4th ring, I answered. I'm here, I said. Silence on the other end. Not a bad connection, but the silence of a man who has rehearsed something and forgotten it the moment the call connected. I could hear traffic noise on his end. He was outside somewhere. She's gone, he said. His voice was flat in the way voices go flat when the emotion has been used up and only the fact remains. She took everything. The money we had left. Her jewelry. Even the television. I came back and the door was open and it was just empty. He stopped. I waited. Dad, he said. Just that word. The same word he had said standing in the doorway of my dark bedroom 4 months ago with the empty box on the nightstand between us. Not a question. Not an accusation. Just the oldest word he had for me offered into the silence because it was the only thing he had left that he was certain of. I stood on the corner of Lexington Avenue and looked at a cab making a left turn onto 46th Street. I know, I said. What do I do? I thought about it. A real moment, not a performed one. Get through today, I said. That's enough for now. I ended the call. Eddie was watching me without appearing to watch me. He going to be all right? Eddie asked. I put my phone in my pocket. I don't know, I said honestly. But that's his work to do now, not mine. We walked back toward the parking garage. Around us, the city moved in all its directions at once, indifferent and continuous the way cities are. The knock came on a Thursday evening in the first week of June. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. I was in the armchair by the window reading a diesel injection manual when the sound came up from the door at the bottom of the stairs. I set the book down and went to the landing and looked through the peephole. Large man, dark jacket over a collared shirt. Weight balanced on both feet in the particular way of someone who had learned that patience was more effective than urgency. He was looking at the door with the expression of a man who had knocked on a great many doors and was prepared to wait for all of them. I opened the door. Mr. Briggs, he said. My name is Marcus Holt. I think you know why I'm here. I have a guess, I said. Come in. He came in and took in the apartment, the way men like Marcus take in spaces, quickly, automatically cataloging exits and contents. I recognized the habit. I had developed the same one 33 years ago in a different place for different reasons. I gestured to the kitchen table. He sat. I poured 2 glasses of water, set one in front of him, and sat across from him. Your son owes me $18,000, he said, extended several times as a professional courtesy. That courtesy has expired. He folded his hands on the table, hands that had healed wrong in places, the particular scarring that does not come from ordinary work. When I contacted Derek last month, he told me you would cover it. Said you had money from a property sale. Said family took care of things. I looked at Marcus Holt across my kitchen table. I thought about Derek standing in a hotel room, picking up a phone using my name, the way you use a tool you assume will be where you left it. Not asking me. Not warning me. Just the name offered as collateral on a debt I knew nothing about. Mr. Holt, I said, I need you to understand something clearly, and I'm going to say it once. I kept my hands flat on the table and my voice level. In the state of New York, a parent has no legal obligation to pay the debts of an adult child. None. Derek is 32 years old. Whatever he told you about my willingness to pay, he told you without my knowledge and without my consent. I held his eyes. You have been lied to. By my son. Not by me. Marcus studied me. Something behind his expression shifted, a recalibration, the adjustment of a man updating his model of a situation he had thought was simpler than it was. That may be true, he said. But you understand my position. Completely, I said. And I'm telling you directly, the position you were put in was created by Derek, not by me. I'm not responsible for promises my son makes in my name, legally or otherwise. He leaned back and looked at me with the full weight of his attention. The kind of look that was probably effective in most rooms. I looked back without moving. After a moment, he said, You don't seem particularly concerned. I'm not, I said. Most people would be. I reached up and pushed my left sleeve to the elbow and laid my arm on the table between us. The scar ran from 2 inches above the wrist to the inside of the elbow. Not a clean line, but a topography raised in places, pulling the skin where it had healed over something deeper. February 1991. A night when being afraid was not available as an option. I spent 9 months in a combat zone doing work that required me to function in conditions that ended most conversations before they started, I said. I came home with that. I nodded at the scar, and a box of medals I kept in a drawer for 33 years. I have no house. No family left in the conventional sense. A 2-room apartment above a dry cleaner and a garage where I fix other people's engines. I rolled my sleeve back down. There is nothing you can threaten that I haven't already lost or decided I can live without. Men with nothing left to protect are the most dangerous men in any room, Mr. Holt. Not because of what they'll do, but because there's nothing you can use against them. The kitchen was quiet. Marcus looked at me for 10 seconds. 15. I watched the arithmetic happening behind his eyes, the real calculation, the one that men like Marcus make, not with bluster, but with the cold logic of risk against return. He looked at the table, then at the door. Your boy's on his own, he said. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the door without looking back. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, unhurried, the steps of a man who had made a business decision and was comfortable with it, and then the street door below opening and closing. I sat at the table for a moment. Then I got up and went to the bedroom and stood in front of Donna's photograph. The mid-laugh, the coffee cup, the complete unawareness of the camera. I had hung it at eye level, so I looked at it straight on. Still standing, Donna, I said. Still standing. I went back to the armchair and picked up the diesel injection manual and found my page. Outside, a bus went by on Hillside Avenue, its brakes sighing at the stop below. The evening light came through the window in long, flat strips across the floor. I read until the light was gone. Then I turned on the lamp and kept reading. Eddie and I finished the truck on the last Saturday of July. We had been working on it since March weekends, mostly the two of us in the South Yonkers garage with the door rolled up and whatever the season brought coming in, off the street. Rebuilt transmission from a contact in Flushing. 4 all-terrain tires, load range E. New rotors, new brake pads, new motor mounts. We took the paint down to bare metal and put on primer and 3 coats of color, a deep midnight blue that Eddie had spent 20 minutes choosing from a paint chip card. "What made you pick that one?" I asked. He turned the chip over in his fingers. "You mentioned once that Donna had a color she liked," he said. "For the front door. Honest blue, you called it." He set the chip down. "This is close." I looked at it for a moment. "Close enough," I said. On the morning we finished, I drove the truck out of the garage and parked it at the curb and stood on the sidewalk and looked at it. A 2014 Ford F-150, 11 years old, 140,000 miles, and it looked like something that had been given back, something it had lost. Not new, it would never be new, but restored to what it was supposed to be before someone had taken pieces of it without permission. Eddie stood beside me with his coffee. "Not bad," he said. "Not bad at all," I said. August came. I worked. I drove the truck through Queens in the early evenings and slept well, and thought less than I had in years about things I could not change. On a Monday morning in the second week of August, I was driving through Yonkers on McLean Avenue when I passed the car wash on the corner of Ashburton. I had passed it 3 or 4 times a week for 30 years without looking at it closely. That morning I looked. Not because of the car wash, because of the man in the blue uniform at the far end of the rinse bay, working the passenger side of a sedan with a pressure wand, his back to the street. I recognized the set of his shoulders before anything else. Derek had his mother's posture upright, without being rigid, a quality I had always associated with something decent that his choices had not yet managed to extinguish. I slowed. He turned, heard the engine or felt something, and for a half-second, we were looking at each other through the windshield. Him with the pressure wand still running me in the cab of the midnight blue truck. Then he dropped the wand and came across the lot fast, pulling off his work gloves, and he was at the passenger window before I had fully stopped. He put both hands on the door and bent down to the glass. I saw Dad. He was breathing hard. "Dad, please, just 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." I looked at my son through the window. I looked at his hands on the door, the same hands I had watched on the camera feed in February, working through my garage in the green-white of the night vision. They were rougher now. Grease under 2 fingernails that had not come out all the way. I thought about what 5 minutes would contain. The apology he had prepared. The explanation he believed would leave room for something to continue. I thought about what Donna had written and what she had not written. She had asked me to refuse to let him stay lost. She had not asked me to stand and receive whatever came after the refusing. Some things once done right complete themselves. The finding the real kind, the kind that holds, cannot happen with someone standing next to you holding a light. It has to happen in the dark. I reached for the window control. The glass rose between us, smoothed the new motor we had installed in June, and I watched my son's face through it as it closed the way you watch something through water. His mouth was still moving when the glass met the seal. I checked the mirror. Road was clear. I put the truck in drive and pulled away from the curb at the speed I always pulled away from curbs. No drama, no urgency. Just a vehicle rejoining traffic. Half a block later, I looked in the rearview mirror. Derek was standing at the edge of the lot where the sidewalk met the asphalt, both hands at his sides. not running, not calling out. Just standing in his blue uniform in the August morning, watching the truck move away from him the way a person watches something they understand they cannot follow. I watched him until the corner of Ashburton took him out of frame. Then I looked at the road ahead. 4 blocks east, the parts supplier was open. The morning was clear and blue, the particular August blue that makes New York look briefly like somewhere designed by someone who loved it. The truck moved under me the way it was supposed to, solid, everything working, every replaced part, doing what replaced parts do when the work has been done correctly. Some doors, I said to the windshield and the morning, and no one in particular. Once you close them right, are meant to stay that way. I drove east. I picked up my parts. I went to work. I found the space in late August. Ground floor of a building on Jamaica Avenue in Queens. A former auto parts store, vacant, 8 months, roll-up door, wide enough for a full-size truck, concrete floor, in good condition, small office in the back, with a window facing east. The landlord was a man named Petros, who owned 4 buildings on that block and managed them with the minimal intervention of someone who had learned that good tenants were worth not bothering. We shook hands on the rent in the first conversation. September went to cleaning and painting and moving equipment from South Yonkers. The lift went in on a Wednesday with Eddie and 2 men from a shop in Mott Haven who owed him a favor. The toolboxes took an afternoon to arrange in the order my first supervisor had taught me in 1987, which I had never found reason to change. On the first Saturday of October, Eddie arrived at 7 with 2 coffees from the bakery on Sutphin Boulevard. "Last boxes," he said, looking around. "You're ready?" "Almost," I said. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and took out the velvet pouch. I set it on the workbench between us and opened it and laid the medals out one at a time. Army Commendation Medal, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Silver Star. Each one cleaned in September with the proper cloth and solution, until the metal held light the way metal holds light when it has been cared for correctly. The display case went on the wall above the workbench. Glass front, dark wood frame, navy blue felt interior. I had mounted it that morning with anchors rated for 40 pounds. I placed the medals inside in their correct order, closed the glass front, and stepped back. The October morning light came through the roll-up door and fell across the case at an angle I had not planned. Eddie stood beside me and did not speak for a moment. "Donna would have liked this place," he said. "She would have repainted the office," I said. "She had opinions about colors." "What color?" "Something warm," I said. "Something that meant it," he nodded. "I know a guy. Does it right." We finished the last boxes by noon. The shop was the way I wanted it, tools in their places, lift-calibrated desk in the office with paperwork organized the way I had always organized it. Carol Marsh called at 2:17. I was checking the coolant level on my truck when the phone rang. "Batintio." "The district attorney's office in Westchester County has formally notified Sienna of the complaint," she said. "She retained an attorney in Florida last week. Her attorney has been in contact with the DA's office. There will be a process." A pause. "It won't be fast, but it is moving." "That's enough," I said. "For now," Carol said. "I'll update you when there's something material." I hung up and stood beside the truck and looked up at the display case through the open roll-up door. The Silver Star caught the afternoon light. I thought about February, the empty box, the lamplight, the long walk from that night to this afternoon. 14 months reduced to a series of decisions, each one made in the quiet, each one carrying weight that I had not known I could carry until I was already carrying it. That evening I moved into the apartment above the shop. 2 rooms smaller than Hillside Avenue, but mine in the way that a thing is yours when you have worked toward it, rather than simply arrived at it. I hung Donna's photograph on the wall beside the window at eye level. I stood in front of it. "I think you'd like it here," I said. "It's honest. It's enough." I looked at her face, the laugh, the coffee cup, the complete unawareness of the camera. "Carol called today. The process is moving. I think I'm going to be all right." I went to bed at 10. I was asleep before 10:15. In 33 years of difficult nights, the desert the months after Donna's diagnosis, the truck and the cheap motels and the hotel room that smelled of someone else's cleaning products, I had come to think of poor sleep as a permanent condition, something to be managed. Something that belonged to me the way the limp belonged to me, the way the scars belonged to me. That night I learned I had been wrong. I slept without dreaming until 6 in the morning, when the light came through the window from the east, and the sounds of Jamaica Avenue starting its day came up from below. I lay in the unfamiliar bed in the new room and understood with the clarity that comes only in the first moments of waking that something had shifted in a way that was not going to shift back. I got up, made coffee, carried it downstairs and opened the roll-up door to the October morning. The silver star caught the early light from the street. I sat on the stool behind the workbench, wrapped both hands around the mug, and looked out at Jamaica Avenue coming to life, buses and foot traffic, and the particular energy of a street that has never once waited for anyone to be ready. I drank my coffee while it was still hot. 14 months. The coffee is going from warm to cool while I sit here thinking instead of drinking. That is the version of me that has always existed, the one who gets distracted by the inside of his own head when something needs to be worked through. Donna used to set a second cup beside the first when she knew I was like this. A backup. She never said anything about it. She just left it there. I want to tell you what I learned. Not what happened. You know what happened from January to October, from the empty box to the silver star on the wall behind me. I want to tell you what I understand about it now that the sequence is complete, and I have had enough mornings of decent sleep to think in straight lines again. The first thing is about silence. People mistake silence for emptiness. They look at a quiet man and decide there is nothing behind the quiet, no depth, no history, no capacity for anything beyond the surface they can see. Derek made that mistake. Sienna made it deliberately, which is a different and more calculated error. Marcus Holt walked into my kitchen ready to make it, and updated his position when the evidence suggested otherwise. Quiet is not weakness. Quiet is where men like me reload. The second thing is about repair. I have spent 30 years fixing engines. A machine breaks for reasons through the accumulation of small decisions made over time by the person responsible for its maintenance. The repair is always possible if the core is sound. If the core is gone, no amount of work will save it. The skill is in knowing the difference. Derek's core is sound. I believe that the way I believe the things Donna wrote because she saw clearly and she wrote what she saw. She was not writing about a lost cause. She was asking me to apply hard hands to something worth saving, and I did. And whatever comes next is his work to do, not mine. The third thing is about cost. People talk about doing the right thing as though it arrives without a price. It does not. I sold a house I had lived in for 23 years. I spent months eating one meal a day when money was thin. I watched my son through a camera feed at 2 in the morning and felt something I do not have a clean name for, not rage, not grief, but the thing that lives between those two that is worse than either because it is quieter. The cost was real. I paid it. I would pay it again. Because the alternative was to look away, and Donna asked me in the clearest words she ever wrote to me on the page I showed Derek in the garage in April not to look away. I think about Sienna sometimes. Not with anger. Anger requires energy I have found better uses for. The process is moving in Florida and in Westchester County, and I have made my peace with the fact that justice in the legal sense and justice in the human sense are related but not the same thing. I gave Carol Marsh everything I had. The rest is not mine to control. I think about Marcus Holt and feel almost nothing. He was a man doing a job. The job brought him to my door. He read the situation accurately and made a sensible decision. There is nothing personal in any of that. I think about Eddie. I think about him most mornings because he is usually here by 7 with coffee from the bakery on Sutphin Boulevard, and strong opinions about what needs doing and a willingness to simply be present that I had forgotten was something a person could offer another person. And I think about Donna every day. That is not new. What is new is the quality of the thinking, less like leaning towards something no longer there and catching yourself before you fall, and more like standing in a room where someone has been and feeling still the specific warmth of their having been there. God puts the right things in front of you at the right time if you are paying attention. Eddie was in that pawn shop because he was supposed to be. The serial number was in that database because someone years ago understood that things of value should be recorded. The journal was in the nightstand drawer because Donna put it there, and Donna put it there because she understood something about the future that I did not yet understand about the present. I do not think any of that is accidental. I do not fix people. I fix engines. I understand engines, their logic, their tendency to fail along predictable lines when neglected in predictable ways. People are more complicated. But people also have the capacity for repairs that no machine can match if they are willing to do the work in the dark without someone standing next to them holding a light. I fix the truck. The truck runs. I open this shop at 7 every morning. I charge fair prices and do honest work, and at the end of each day, I lock the roll-up door and go upstairs and make dinner and look out the window at Queens doing what Queens does. The quietest man in the room is usually the one carrying the heaviest story. And sometimes, if he is patient enough and honest enough and willing to do the hard thing when it needs doing, that story ends exactly the way it should. I finished my coffee. I went to work. I am not a wise man. I am a mechanic who fixed his own life the same way he fixes engines one broken part at a time without skipping steps. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story, silence is not surrender. Patience is not weakness. And sometimes the most powerful thing a man can do is nothing until the moment when everything needs to be done at once. I believe God puts the right people in front of you at the right time. Eddie was in that pawn shop for a reason. Donna's journal was in that drawer for a reason. I just had to be paying attention. My personal opinion, family justice is not about revenge. It is about boundaries. It is about refusing to let love become a license for someone to destroy you. The dad's revenge stories, you hear the ones where the father finally draws the line. They are not about fighting back. They are about deciding that enough is enough. If you see yourself in Derek, I am not here to judge you. I am here to say it is not too late to become someone your mother would recognize. Don't mistake silence for weakness. That mistake, as this story shows, is very expensive. If this story of family justice and these dad's revenge stories meant something to you, leave a comment and tell me what you would have done differently. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if stories like these move you, subscribe to Silent Revenge with Phoenix. More stories are coming. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements created for entertainment and educational purposes. Some details have been dramatized. If this type of content is not right for you, we completely respect that. Please feel free to find content that serves you better.